In 1922, a British archaeologist named Howard Carter cut through a sealed doorway in the Valley of the Kings and became the first person in over 3,000 years to lay eyes on the tomb of a boy king named Tutankhamun. Gold masks, ebony thrones, chariots built for a ruler who died before he turned 20. But tucked among the treasure were dozens of sealed clay jars, and when researchers eventually opened them, they found something almost nobody expected still to be usable after 3 millennia sealed in the dark. It was soft. It was gold-colored. It was sweet. Archaeologists actually tasted it, and it was, by every account, still perfectly edible. Now stretch that timeline back even further. Long before Egypt had pharaohs, before anyone had built a pyramid or carved a hieroglyph, human beings were already climbing sheer cliff faces on hand-braided ropes, smoking angry insects with fire, and reaching directly into open air to steal something so valuable they were willing to risk falling to their deaths for it. Not gold, not metal, not even food in the ordinary sense. A liquid made by insects, stored in wax, guarded by thousands of stingers. Honey. Today, you can walk into almost any grocery store in the world and buy a plastic bear full of it for around $4. It sits in your pantry, mostly ignored, occasionally drizzled onto toast. For most of human history, though, it was one of the most dangerous, sacred, and fiercely guarded substances on Earth. People bled for it. People built entire religious systems around it. People painted its theft onto cave walls thousands of years before anyone figured out how to domesticate the animals that made it. So how did a jar of insect vomit, essentially, become a divine currency powerful enough to pay taxes, embalm kings, and fund empires, before ending up squeezed onto a peanut butter sandwich? And how is it possible that people were raiding wild beehives on cliffsides 8,000 years before anyone thought to build them a box to live in? This story does not start in Egypt, and it does not start with bees and hives at all. It starts on a cliff face in eastern Spain, in a river valley near a town called Baikor, roughly 8,000 years ago, long before beekeeping existed as an idea. High on the rock walls of a cave complex called Cuevas de la Araña, the Spider Caves, prehistoric artists left behind a painting that has become one of the most famous images in the history of human food. It shows a lone figure, dangling from what appears to be a rope or a vine, reaching into a crack in a cliff where wild bees had built their nest. Around the figure, small dots swarm through the air. Angry, disturbed, dangerous. This is widely regarded as the oldest surviving depiction of honey hunting on Earth, and similar honey hunting scenes have turned up at other rock art sites across the same region of Spain, some estimated at 7,500 years old, showing figures climbing rope ladders toward hollow trees and rock crevices to rob wild colonies. These were not farmers. These were not beekeepers. There was no such thing yet. These were foragers who had figured out through pure trial, error, and probably a fair number of stings, that hanging off a cliff by a hand-braided rope was worth it for what waited in that crack in the stone. Picture the actual mechanics of it for a moment. No ladder bolted to stone, no harness, just a hand-woven rope, a burning torch, or a bundle of smoking leaves to disorient the colony, and bare skin exposed to thousands of defending insects at once. A fall meant broken bones or death on the rocks below. A swarm meant dozens, sometimes hundreds of stings in a matter of seconds, on the face, the hands, the eyes. There was no antihistamine waiting at home. There was no emergency room. And people did it anyway, repeatedly, generation after generation, because whatever waited inside that crack in the rock was worth the risk. Think about that for a second. No smoke calibrated by centuries of technique, no protective suit, no understanding of bee biology whatsoever. Just raw nerve and a taste for something sweet in a world that offered almost nothing sweet at all. Honey is one of the only concentrated sugars that exists ready-made in nature, and in a world without cane sugar, without refined anything, a wild beehive represented one of the most calorie-dense, immediately rewarding food sources a hunter-gatherer could find. That is not a small thing. In a world of scarcity, calories were survival, and something this sweet, this fast, was worth the risk of a fall or 1,000 stings. This tradition did not die out with the Stone Age either. Honey hunting on this scale is still practiced today. In parts of Nepal, hunters from Gurung communities still climb rope ladders hundreds of feet up sheer Himalayan cliff faces to harvest honey from the world's largest honeybee, Apis laboriosa, using techniques that have barely changed in thousands of years. In parts of Africa, honey hunters have an actual working partnership with a wild bird called the greater Honeyguide, which leads humans to hidden hives with a specific chattering call, waits for the humans to crack the nest open, and then eats the wax and larvae left behind. Neither species could reliably find honey alone as efficiently as they can together. That relationship likely stretches back tens of thousands of years, long before anyone painted anything on a cave wall. Here is the detail that makes this strange. Beekeeping, the actual domestication of bees into hives that humans controlled, did not show up until roughly 3000 BC in ancient Egypt. That means for roughly 5,000 years, give or take, human beings were raiding wild hives with nothing but rope, smoke, and nerve, long before anyone thought to simply keep the bees themselves. That is where the story turns, because it is in Egypt where honey stops being something people merely steal and becomes something people build an economy around. By around 2650 BC, Egyptian artisans were carving detailed scenes of organized beekeeping into the walls of the solar temple of a pharaoh named Niuserre. The relief shows workers using smoke to calm bees, pulling honeycomb out of hives, and packing it into clay storage jars, an operational system, not a lucky accident. The Egyptians built their hives out of stacked cylindrical pipes of Nile mud and clay, and they physically floated these hives up and down the Nile River on rafts, chasing the seasonal bloom of flowers from south to north as the growing season progressed. This was mobile managed agriculture, organized at the level of the state, more than 4,500 years ago. And the honey itself. It was not just food. It was currency, medicine, cosmetic, and sacred substance all rolled into one sticky golden package. Egyptian marriage contracts survive that specify honey as an annual payment. 12 jars a year in one documented case, delivered from husband to wife as a formal obligation. Conquered territories paid honey as tribute to Egyptian rulers. The Retenu people of Syria, after their defeat by the pharaoh Thutmose III, paid annual honey tribute to their conquerors. This was not a battle. It was a statement. The bee itself became a symbol of the Egyptian state. As early as 3500 BC, the honeybee represented the king of Lower Egypt, paired with the reed that represented Upper Egypt, and the honeybee hieroglyph appeared in royal titles for millennia afterward. Pharaohs literally carried the title Lord of Bees. Sacred animals, including a sacred bull and a sacred crocodile kept in dedicated temple pools, were fed cakes sweetened with honey as ritual offerings. Sarcophagi were sealed with beeswax. Bodies were sometimes embalmed using honey itself, prized for properties the Egyptians could not have explained scientifically, but clearly understood empirically, because honey resists bacteria and does not spoil under the right conditions. This was not about taste. Honey was medicine, currency, and preservative, and the Egyptians used it as all three at once. Speaking of medicine, this is the part that should genuinely surprise you. Egyptian medical papyri survive listing hundreds of prescriptions and remedies, and researchers who have studied them have found that honey appears as an ingredient in roughly 500 out of around 900 documented treatments, used for everything from dressing wounds and treating burns to soothing coughs. Modern science has since confirmed that raw honey genuinely does have antibacterial and antiseptic properties, low moisture content, and natural acidity that make it hostile to many microbes. The Egyptians did not know the word antimicrobial, they were using it anyway. And the scale of it all is genuinely hard to overstate. When Howard Carter's team finally finished cataloging the contents of Tutankhamun's tomb, they counted well over 2,000 individual jars of preserved honey buried alongside the young pharaoh, enough to feed him, according to Egyptian belief, through an eternity in the afterlife. This was not an isolated luxury reserved for one boy king either. Beekeeping in Egypt was organized and regulated by the state itself, which strongly suggests it was being produced at genuine industrial scale, not as some rare delicacy trickling out for the elite alone. The story of honey was about to travel far past the banks of the Nile, into the myths, medicine cabinets, and religious rituals of nearly every ancient civilization that followed it. The Greeks inherited a version of this reverence and dressed it in mythology. They believed the gods themselves survived on the substance called ambrosia, often described as honey or honey-derived, the food that made the immortals immortal. Zeus, according to one widely told legend, was supposedly raised as an infant on the milk of a goat and the honey of sacred bees on the island of Crete, hidden from his father Cronus, who had a nasty habit of eating his own children. Now, that story is almost certainly myth rather than history, but the fact that Greek storytellers reached for honey specifically as the substance fit to raise a king of gods tells you something about how they ranked it. At the religious site of Delphi, the priestesses who delivered the oracle's prophecies were known by the title Melissa, which simply means honeybee, and the word itself threads through Greek religious vocabulary in ways that are hard to miss once you notice them. The Greeks also treated beekeeping as something worth studying scientifically, not just mythologizing. Aristotle, in the 4th century BC, wrote one of the earliest detailed technical accounts of a beehive's structure and internal operations that survives from antiquity, remarkably accurate for an era with no microscopes and no understanding of insect biology as we know it today. There were even trained specialist beekeepers in the Greek world, known as melissaorgoi, professionals with actual expertise, not casual hobbyists. This was skilled labor, respected labor, centuries before anyone in Europe would think to write a manual on how to farm bees properly. The Romans, who absorbed and repurposed a great deal of Greek culture, carried this reverence forward with characteristic bureaucratic thoroughness. The poet Virgil devoted an entire book of his agricultural poem The Georgics to the management of bees, treating apiculture as worthy of the same literary seriousness as growing grain or raising livestock. Roman cooks blended honey with vinegar to create a sour-sweet tonic called oxymel, used both as a food and as a folk remedy. And Roman law even regulated where apiaries could legally be placed relative to a neighbor's property, an early sign of just how economically significant beekeeping had become across the empire. Sweet was scarce, sweet was valuable, and wherever Rome went, honey went with it. Meanwhile, in an entirely unconnected part of the world, the Maya civilization of Mesoamerica developed its own sophisticated relationship with a completely different species, the stingless bee. Maya beekeepers cultivated these gentle native bees in hollow log hives long before European contact, associating the practice with a specific bee deity and treating the resulting honey as sacred, used in ceremony and medicine, much the way Old World cultures used honey from the common honeybee. Two civilizations, separated by an ocean and thousands of years of independent development, arrived at strikingly similar conclusions. This substance deserves reverence, ritual, and careful stewardship. Back in Europe and moving north through the centuries, honey took on a different but equally central role. Because for most of European history, up until sugarcane products became widely available and affordable, honey was essentially the only concentrated sweetener most people had access to. There was no alternative sitting on a shelf. If you wanted something sweet in your food, in your medicine, in your drink, honey was it. That single fact explains an enormous amount of what happened next. Fermented honey and water, known as mead, was one of the oldest alcoholic beverages produced by humans. brewed across cultures from northern Europe to the Caucasus, treated by some Norse and Germanic peoples as a drink worthy of gods and warriors alike. Meanwhile, across much of medieval Eastern Europe, particularly in the vast forests of what is now Poland, Belarus, and Russia, an entire specialized profession emerged around forest beekeeping, known as bort or bortnichestvo, in which skilled foresters climbed tall trees, carved out cavities for wild colonies to nest in, and returned to harvest the honey, a hybrid practice somewhere between hunting and true domestication. This industry was significant enough that in several Slavic principalities, honey and beeswax became legitimate units of taxation and tribute, valuable enough that rulers demanded payment in it rather than in coin. And that brings us to the church, because honey's other essential medieval role had almost nothing to do with sweetness at all: beeswax. European Christianity required enormous quantities of beeswax candles to light churches, cathedrals, and monasteries. And unlike tallow candles made from animal fat, which smoked and smelled foul, beeswax burned clean and bright. Monasteries across medieval Europe kept bees specifically to supply their own chapels with candles, which meant honey, the byproduct of that wax production, flowed out of monastic beekeeping operations as almost a secondary bonus. Religion, quite literally, kept the beekeeping industry alive through some of Europe's darkest and most economically stagnant centuries. This is where the story takes a genuinely strange turn, because honey's symbolic power did not stay confined to ancient temples and medieval monasteries. It resurfaced, of all places, in the coronation robes of Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1653, workers in Tournai, in what is now Belgium, accidentally discovered the tomb of Childeric I, a 5th century Frankish king, and inside it they found roughly 300 small golden ornaments shaped like bees, sewn originally into the king's ceremonial cloak. For over a millennium, these golden bees sat largely forgotten, until Napoleon, crowning himself Emperor of the French in 1804, revived the symbol deliberately, choosing the bee as his own imperial emblem. Bees represented industriousness, immortality, and resurrection, precisely the kind of ancient monarchical legitimacy a self-made emperor desperately wanted to project. Napoleon had bees embroidered across his coronation robes, stamped onto his throne, and carved into palace decorations across France. A man who built one of the largest empires in European history chose as his personal symbol the same insect that ordinary foragers had been robbing off cliff faces for 10,000 years. Whether every detail of the Childeric bee legend has been perfectly preserved through the centuries remains a subject some historians debate, but the resulting symbolism is beyond dispute. You can still find Napoleonic bees stitched into French state ceremonial objects and museum collections today. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what comes next, because Honey's story is about to swing from imperial symbolism into hard mechanical invention, the single innovation that finally dragged beekeeping out of the medieval era and into something resembling modern industry. For roughly 10,000 years, from the first cliffside honey raids to the mudpipe hives of Egypt to the straw baskets called skeps that European beekeepers used for centuries, harvesting honey typically meant destroying the colony that made it. Skep hives had no removable parts. To get at the comb inside, beekeepers usually killed the bees outright, often by smothering the hive with burning sulfur, and started fresh with a new colony the following season. It worked in the sense that it produced honey. It was also wasteful, brutal on bee populations, and offered no way to inspect a hive for disease or manage its health. Then, in 1851, an American pastor named Lorenzo Langstroth, a Yale graduate turned amateur beekeeper in Massachusetts, noticed something oddly specific. When bees were left with a gap of roughly 1 centimeter, a little under half an inch, they would neither build wax comb into that space nor seal it shut with the sticky plant resin they use as caulk. Anything smaller they filled in, anything larger they built comb through. This narrow, precise gap became known as bee space, and Langstroth realized he could design an entire hive around it, a wooden box holding a series of vertical frames, each spaced exactly one bee space apart that bees would never glue down or connect to the walls. On October 5, 1852, Langstroth received a United States patent for the world's first genuinely practical movable frame beehive. For the first time in the entire history of the relationship between humans and bees, a beekeeper could lift a single frame straight out of a working colony, inspect it, harvest the honey, and slide it right back in without killing a single bee or dismantling the hive. Langstroth published a book on his method the following year that went through more than 40 editions and remained in print for well over a century. Here is the detail that does not get enough credit. Roughly 75% of all beehives in active use around the world today are still built on Langstroth's basic 19th century design. A country pastor's obsession with the exact width of a gap between honeycombs quietly became the backbone of a global industry. Now here is the part of honey's story that gets uncomfortable. And it deserves to be told without softening it because it involves real fraud, real public health risk, and a genuinely staggering amount of money. In the early 21st century, honey became one of the most faked foods on the planet, ranked by some food safety analysts as the third most commonly adulterated food in the world, behind only milk and olive oil. The mechanics of the fraud were simple. Cheap sugar syrups, often derived from rice or corn, could be blended into real honey or laundered through third countries and relabeled entirely as honey from somewhere else to dodge tariffs and undercut legitimate producers on price. In 2001, the United States determined that Chinese honey was being dumped into American markets at prices so far below fair value that it threatened to destroy domestic beekeepers, and it imposed steep anti-dumping duties in response, in some cases exceeding 200% of the honey's declared value. That decision seemed like the end of the story. It was not. Chinese honey exporters and international middlemen began routing shipments through other countries, relabeling the origin on customs paperwork, and funneling the product into the United States anyway, evading the tariffs entirely. Investigators eventually nicknamed the resulting law enforcement operation Project Honeygate. The first wave of charges filed in 2008 targeted more than a dozen individuals, including executives at a German food conglomerate, and led to the seizure of over 3,000 illegally imported drums of honey, tied to an estimated $80 million in evaded duties. A second wave of charges in 2013 went after the buyers on the American side, including two of the largest honey processing companies in the country, who ultimately admitted wrongdoing and paid multi-million-dollar fines. Altogether, investigators estimated that the smuggling scheme evaded more than $180 million in duties. $180 million. Here is the uncomfortable reality that made this more than a simple pricing scandal. Some of the smuggled Chinese honey was later found to contain antibiotics that are not approved for use in food products anywhere in the United States, banned specifically because of their potential health risks, including a documented link to serious blood disorders in some studies. Separate laboratory testing conducted by food safety researchers found that ultrafiltration, a processing technique that strips out the pollen honey naturally contains, had been used on a striking share of honey tested at retail stores nationwide, which matters because pollen is the primary forensic evidence investigators use to trace where honey actually came from in the first place. Strip the pollen, and you strip the ability to prove the fraud. This was not incompetence. This was a cover-up built directly into the product itself. None of this touches the other quiet crisis unfolding in beekeeping over the same decades. Honeybee colonies collapsing at alarming rates across North America and Europe, driven by a tangled mix of pesticide exposure, particularly a class of chemicals called neonicotinoids, along with disease, parasites, and habitat loss. Bees do not just make honey. They pollinate an enormous share of the crops that feed the human race, and their decline is a threat that reaches far beyond your breakfast toast. That profit motive and that fragility is where honey's ancient story collides head-on with its modern one. Today, global honey production runs at roughly 1.8 to 2 million metric tons a year, a market valued in the billions of dollars. China alone produces somewhere in the range of 450 to nearly 500,000 tons annually, dwarfing every other country on Earth and running an industry that includes roughly 15 million registered bee colonies. India comes in a distant second, producing well under a third of what China does, followed by Turkey, Ethiopia, and Iran rounding out the next tier of major producers. The United States, despite being one of the largest consumers of honey in the world, ranks well outside the top handful of producers, which is precisely the imbalance that made honey laundering so profitable in the first place. But honey is far more than just a food product today, and this next part tends to catch people off guard. Modern medicine has circled back around to something ancient Egyptian physicians already understood 4,000 years ago. Medical-grade honey, produced under sterile regulated conditions, is now used in hospitals and approved as a legitimate wound care treatment in a number of countries, applied directly to burns, ulcers, and surgical wounds because of its genuine antibacterial properties, some of it even showing promise against certain antibiotic-resistant bacterial strains that terrify modern doctors. A substance ancient scribes were writing prescriptions for in the time of the pharaohs is now sitting in the supply closets of contemporary hospital burn units. Full circle does not begin to describe it. Here's a curveball worth sitting with for a second. Not all honey today sells for $4 a bottle. A specific variety called Manuka honey, produced almost exclusively by bees foraging on the Manuka shrub native to New Zealand and parts of Australia, has become one of the most expensive honeys on Earth, prized for unusually high levels of a natural antibacterial compound called methylglyoxal. Certified high-grade jars, verified under an official rating system New Zealand producers use to prove authenticity, can sell for well over $100 for a relatively small jar. And demand has grown so intensely that Manuka honey now has its own fraud problem, with far more Manuka honey sold globally each year than New Zealand's bee population could plausibly produce. The same story, essentially, that played out with Chinese honey laundering, just wearing more expensive packaging. 10,000 years after cave painters risked a fall onto rock for a taste of something sweet, people are still faking honey, still fighting over it, still willing to pay absurd sums for the good stuff. It was there, on a cliff face in Spain, 8,000 years before anyone thought to build a hive. It was there, in the tombs of pharaohs, sealed in jars that stayed edible for 3,000 years. It was there, in the myths of Greek gods, in the golden ornament sewn into a Frankish king's cloak. It was there, stitched onto Napoleon's coronation robes as a symbol of empire. It was there, quietly, funding monasteries through Europe's darkest centuries in the form of church candles. It was there, behind one of the largest food fraud investigations in American history. And it is there, right now, sitting in hospital wound care kits, treating patients modern antibiotics cannot always reach. And it is there in your kitchen too, in a plastic bear-shaped bottle, usually forgotten at the back of a cupboard, costing you about the same as a cup of coffee. Not bad for something people once risked their lives on a rope dangling off a cliff just to steal a taste of. If any part of this surprised you, let me know in the comments which one. I genuinely want to know. And if you enjoyed this, do me a favor and hit subscribe because we have a lot more stories like this one coming. I will see you in the next one.